Hey everyone, today I'm going to have a little bit of an interesting discussion and probably one of the more divisive topics that I'm going to be presenting as we continue to talk about and hopefully predict what can Monster Hunter Generation 6 end up being. And essentially I'm wondering if you guys would prefer, and I certainly would love to hear some feedback in the comments section, would you prefer Monster Hunter 6 Generation 6 to be closer to Monster Hunter World 2, a pseudo sequel to Monster Hunter World 2, a continuation of what they did with Iceborne, or basically try to follow up what Rise and Sunbreak did, both visually, aesthetically, and gameplay wise, because ultimately both games present very different types of experiences, and I think the more people got accustomed to playing World and then they eventually made their jump into Rise and Sunbreak, they found it to be a little bit different. Obviously visually it's a whole different thing, but of course gameplay wise the game just feels faster, it feels different. And of course the introduction of Palamutes and Silkbind attacks and the wire bugs just changes the mechanics completely. So that's kind of like the discussion that I wanted to have today. Do you want the next generation game to be closer to World, a continuation of that vein? And does it make the most amount of sense for Capcom to actually chase that? Or would you want them to kind of continue with what they did with Rise and Sunbreak? Yes, maybe visually speaking, it won't be a juggernaut, but you're expecting bigger, better maps, faster gameplay, and more intuitive options for new players to jump in and have a better time. So first and foremost, I kind of want to talk about it in the sense of like, well, let's say they do go the Monster Hunter World route, right? We've talked a lot about Monster Hunter World 2 could be potentially what they're really trying to achieve this time around. Although they might not call it World, although just for naming conventions aside, I will say this, Monster Hunter World has way more recognizable tangents, if you wouldn't put it that way. You can actually look up like which words, which terms for Monster Hunter are more popular, Monster Hunter World or Monster Hunter Rise. And Monster Hunter World has actually way more search results if you actually want to look at it that way. World has had way more name recognition throughout the entire gaming landscapes that Rise and Sunbreak did, for obvious reasons. When World was originally introduced, originally the trailer might have had a little bit of a negative fallback. People didn't necessarily like what they saw originally. But when Capcom reintroduced it a few months later and they actually showcased a better side of the game, it ended up getting a lot of recognition, and ultimately sales speak for themselves. We know that World and Iceborne together sold way more than Rise and Sunbreak. I believe about a third more at the end of the day. So yes, World in and of itself, the naming convention alone does have some power. So if they just decide to do Monster Hunter World 2, I wouldn't necessarily fault Capcom for going that route. At the same time, heading into the launch of base Monster Hunter World, one of the things that the developers spoke about is that they wanted to build off subsequent games off of what World was already working on. They were using World as a base, as I believe this very specific quote that they said, for the next 10 years. I don't remember if Ryosuke Sugimoto said that, but it might have been the producer for Monster Hunter World who originally said that. So while that may be outdated information at this point in time, and I can't really speak on what they really want to do going forward, it does make me wonder if they do view still Monster Hunter World as a baseline experience for what they still want to continue to build forward. And the only reason why we ended up getting Rise and Sunbreak at the very least in the way that we did was because they were catering to that on-the-go player audience on the Nintendo Switch. So it still remains to be seen in that regard. So naming convention, certainly they have, you have a lot of going for World. Visually, I think it was kind of like something that a lot of players specifically decided to play Monster Hunter World originally because of the visuals, regarding if the gameplay wasn't necessarily up to, let's say, the same standard that a lot of players were hoping it to be from previous iterations back on the 3DS, PSP, and all of those games. Yes, it was faster. Yes, they were changing some things, but maybe not to the degree that we ended up seeing in Rise and Sunbreak. And transitioning over to the push for what the next generation could potentially be if they do decide to pick up on what they did with Rise and Sunbreak, The argument against it would simply be that Rise and Sunbreak was made and developed by the B team. So the A team has always been working on the next mainline Monster Hunter game. That would be the argument. However, I would argue that, you know, yes, the development team, the second development team, while, you know, essentially being called the B team, they did a fantastic job with Rise and Sunbreak. And at the end of the day, I think they were able to cater to a more casual audience because the game was just easier to be introduced to new players than ever before. Even World, what a lot of people still said it was the easiest time to ever play Monster Hunter, then Rise and Sunbreak came out and the game became even more, you know, easily accessible for even more casual players, especially on the Nintendo Switch. We know, we take a closer look at the sales and they did a bang up job on that. Then, of course, the fact that the scalability aspect of it. Yes, you can play it on the Nintendo Switch, which is essentially the quote-unquote the worst-looking version of the game. But then you can upscale it all the way to the PC with the highest settings, and it runs flawlessly. 120 FPS, you know, 4K, no upscaler needed. It just looks beautiful. It looks great. Now, at the same time, of course, the next mainline game could potentially have a much bigger, you know, higher definition set of visuals, better textures, better animations, all those things, but still be built on what they already worked on with Rise and Sunbreak. And of course, I'm talking about the RE engine. They have been doing an amazing job with exactly the results that they are getting with this engine. Of course, it was originally developed for Resident Evil, but now pretty much almost all of the major Capcom games are transitioning over to the RE engine, and this is of course the reason why Rise and Sunbreak looks so good, especially on the Nintendo Switch. And presumably going forward, they could just scale it up even more. You know, they can make games look even better, more realistic. Of course, you look at those Resident Evil remakes, for example, Resident Evil 2 remake. That game looks stunning. You know, you take a closer look at Resident Evil 4 remake and it looks even better. So it's one of those things where like scalability trumps a lot of the stuff that you would argue. Like, yes, you want, you know, better cell shades, you want better textures, you want better resolution, all of that. But scalability matters, especially if we're talking about, and this is something that I spoke in a previous video, do you want the game to scale on a potential Switch 2, on a PlayStation 4, on a PlayStation 5, on a PlayStation 5 Pro, PC, Xbox One, Series X, Series X? You want it to play on all of those consoles at the same time. You certainly want it to have scalability, and the RE engine provides you that. Whether, you know, the base world can be, you know, at the very least the original engine can be upscaled to those degrees, it really wavers. You know, originally World on PlayStation 4 at the very least didn't really have the best, you know, frame rates, and certainly not the best resolution. It took up to the PlayStation 5 to kind of see what the game really was able to look at. Of course, on PC it always looked great. If you had a top-end GPU, if you had a really good graphics card, you were able to run the game relatively, you know, at the highest settings pretty much with ease. But on PlayStation 4, it took a while. PlayStation 4 Pro even, you know, took longer, and then eventually on the PS5 we were finally able to kind of unshackle the game as best as they could. But still, it visually still just ends up looking the same. A lot of that checkerboard rendering never really, you know, outlived its usefulness, and at the end of the day it just kind of looks grimy at the end of the day from my personal perspective. So certainly I want to hear your guys' feedback on this. Visually speaking, I think a lot more people would say that they want the game, the next mainline game, you know, to be based off of what World did and build up on that. Whether they call it World 2 or whatever, it's irrelevant. Naming conventions aside, doesn't really make a difference. But I would actually argue that it makes a lot more sense for Capcom, especially if they're using the RE engine and a whole heck of a lot more graphical fidelity to make it run on that specific base of what the game provided, and then take those base elements that they already gave us, you know, the speed and the gameplay mechanics that you saw on Rise and Sunbreak, just notch it up to 12, you know, faster loading, faster traversal, bigger and bigger, and of course bigger maps, which players is exactly what they want, as long as they don't become open world. I think if they become open world, then I think we can realistically expect something in the RE engine, because they just need, again, scalability to matter. But if we're looking for, once again, slightly, you know, standoffish maps, you load into a map and then you explore it until your heart's desire with multiple layers like they did in World, I think they can certainly continue the work that they did there and build upon it. But certainly, I want to hear your guys' feedback on this. I think it's one of those sticking points that I think a lot of people are gonna, regardless of whichever decision Capcom decides to make, it's always going to be one of those things where like some subset of people are going to say, I wish they did X instead of that. And whichever choice they do is always going to be one side of the aisle complaining that they didn't necessarily get what they wanted. So do let me know in the comments what you guys think. But if you're brand new to my channel, be sure to leave a like and subscribe. Hit the bell to receive notifications when the videos go up. And as always, thank you so much for watching. See ya.